כי מציון תצא תורה ודבר ים מירושלים. כי מציון תצא תורה ודבר ים מירושלים. ברוך שנתן תורה לעמו ישראל בקדושתו. ברוך שנתן תורה לעמו ישראל בקדושתו. And we say the blessings together before reading the Torah. Baruch hu et Adonai Amvorach, Baruch Adonai Amvorach leolam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu im kol ha'amim, ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוכה את שכינה נותנת התורה.
So we're continuing in the saga story of Joseph, who's in Egypt, and his father and his brothers who are in Canaan. And what happened last week was that the father, Jacob, and all the brothers got to the point in Canaan where they were too hungry because of the famine. We're in the midst of the famine. If you remember, there were going to be 7 years of abundance, which we've now had, and 7 years of famine. And so we're in the midst of the famine, and the brothers came to Egypt to try to buy what's what I'm looking for, food, grain, so that they could survive. And they were then sent back with provisions. Joseph did not reveal himself at that point. They were sent back with provisions and told to not come back again for more provisions unless they bring Benjamin. So they bring Benjamin back, and Joseph still hides his identity, and he places in Benjamin's sack, as he's sending them all back to Canaan with all the supplies, Joseph's divination cup. And when they come to find it, the brothers say, well, whoever sack it's found in, he will be a slave for life. And of course, Joseph's placed it in Benjamin's sack, but they don't know that. So they take Benjamin back, and the brothers all come back to Egypt with him. And that's where we begin this week's Parsha. At that very moment, they're all back in Joseph's home, in Joseph's palace. And so we'll start right there. That's all I'll say for now, but we will interrupt many times as we're reading, as we always do. This is if you read my email that we sent out about the description of this week's Parsha, it's, I guess we have a lot of challenging Parshas, but this one kind of sets the stage, let's say, for the exile of the Hebrews into Egypt and for their enslavement, I would argue. So let's begin. If somebody's willing to read the English, that would be great.
We're in chapter 44.
44, line 18, it looks like, from here. Let me find it for you.
Here.
Somebody want to?
If nobody has a desire, I'll be willing to read. It's Heidi.
Go ahead, Heidi, thanks.
Then Judah went up to him and said, "Please, my lord, let your servant appeal to my lord, and do not be impatient with your servant, you who are the equal of Pharaoh." My lord asked his servants, "Have you a father or another brother?" We told my lord, "We have an old father, and there is a child of his old age, the youngest. His full brother is dead, so that he alone is left of his mother, and his father dotes on him." Then you said to your servants, "Bring him down to me, that I may set eyes on him." We said to my lord, "The boy cannot leave his father. If he were to leave him, his father would die." But you said to your servants, Unless your younger brother comes down with you, do not let me see your faces. When we came back to your servant, my father, we reported my lord's words to him. Later, our father said, go back and procure some food for us. We answered, we cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother is with us can we go down, for we may not show our faces to the man unless our youngest brother is with us. Your servant, my father, said to us, as you know, my wife bore me 2 sons, but one is gone from me. And I said, alas, he was torn by a beast, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and he meets with disaster, you will send my white head down to Sheol in sorrow. Now, if I come to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us, since his whole life is so bound up with his, when he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die, and your servant will send the white head of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in grief. Now your servant has pledged himself for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, I shall stand guilty before my father forever. Therefore, please let your servant remain as a slave to my lord instead of the boy, and let the boy go back to his brothers. Back with his brothers, sorry. For how can I go back to my father unless the boy is with me? Let me not be the witness to the woe that would overtake my father.
I'm going to jump in here for a minute. So I'm going to pause reading. Thank you, Heidi. We can continue in a moment. Beautiful. Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. So right at the beginning, it says, Judah approached him and said, if you please, my lord, may my servant speak a word in my Lord's ear, and let not your anger flare up at your servant. Now that languaging reminds me of when Abraham challenged God with Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Like, please, I'm going to challenge you, but let me not make you so angry. So it's a submission, but also acknowledgement that I'm going to say something that's going to be challenging, which I think is actually kind of beautifully phrased, right? Not necessarily the Lord part, but just like, I'm going to say something that's going to be difficult to hear. Be forewarned it's going to happen, and try not to let your anger flare up. And as I think about the amount of challenging things perhaps that we need to say in this world right now that really does upset people a lot, I think that might be a really nice model. Like, I'm warning you, I'm going to say something that's going to be challenging to you. Hold your anger at bay, please. I've now given you warning. Take a deep breath. Reset your nervous system. Be aware that this is going to happen, and see if you can take it in. So I just wanted to bring that, uplift that, because I think it's really quite powerful, and a model that I hadn't thought of until just now. So then, and then he says, for you are like Pharaoh. So in the plain meaning of that, right, we can take that to mean he's like Pharaoh because he's ruling Egypt right now. He's the ruler of Egypt. That's kind of how we would read it, right? If you're reading it, that's maybe how you would read that. But there's other interesting interpretations of that. A midrash says, so in this scene right now, Joseph basically is going to take Benjamin as a slave unjustly. And so he says, the midrash says, you'll be stricken with leprosy like the previous Pharaoh who held Sarah. So when Abraham and Sarah went down to Egypt, if you remember, Abraham said to Sarah, tell him you're my sister, otherwise they'll kill me. And we had a big discussion about how problematic that was. And then the Pharaoh, she goes into the Pharaoh's home, and then the Pharaoh's struck with illness. And so he's saying, the Midrash is saying, what he's really saying is you're like Pharaoh because you're going to be struck with leprosy for this unjust act. Interestingly to me, in the story with Abraham and Sarah, Pharaoh doesn't know he's acting unjustly because he's being deceived. Right? He's being told that Sarah is his sister. in this scene, Joseph is the one who's deceiving. So even more so that what he's doing is unjust, right? And then the other thing that they say, which I really like, is that Joseph is like Pharaoh because he exploits the vulnerable. And so in this scene, Joseph is exploiting Benjamin and his brothers who are vulnerable in this moment because they need food and they don't understand what's really happening behind the scenes in terms of Joseph being the brother. But also, as you'll see as the story unfolds, Joseph, we've already seen this a little bit, Joseph ends up exploiting the Egyptians by taking their money and eventually their land, so that they essentially have to then sell themselves into indentured servitude. So we'll get to that. But it's almost like predicting, foreshadowing what's coming here, which is you are like Pharaoh, you exploit the vulnerable. So there's lots of, this is kind of one of the fun things about the Torah, right? Is that the rabbis take it at the face level, the pshat level, which is you are like Pharaoh because you are like the king. Pharaoh's giving you all the power. But then they read it through these other psycho-spiritual levels too. So if anyone wants to share any reflections about that, feel free to unmute or open. Go ahead and share, or we'll keep reading. We're good? Okay, Heidi, you want to pick up?
Sure. Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone withdraw from me." So there was no one else about when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. His sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear, and so the news reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still well?" But his brothers could not answer him. So dumbfounded were they on account of him. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come forward to me." And when they came forward, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, he whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me hither. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. It is now 2 years that there has been famine in the land, and there are still 5 years to come in which there shall be no yield from tilling. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. So it was not you who sent me here, but God, who has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of all his household, and ruler over the whole land of Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me without delay. You will dwell in the region of Goshen, where you will be near me, you and your children and your grandchildren, your flocks and your herds, and all that is yours. There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, that you and your household and all that is yours may not suffer want. You can see for yourselves and my brother Benjamin for himself that it is indeed I who am speaking to you. And you must tell my father everything about my high station in Egypt and all that you have seen, and bring my father here with all speed." With that, he embraced his brother Benjamin around the neck and wept. And Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. Only then his brothers able to talk to him. The news reached Pharaoh's palace. "Joseph's brothers have come." Pharaoh and his courtiers were pleased, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Say to your brothers, do as follows: load up your beasts and go at once to the land of Canaan. Take your father and your households and come to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you shall live off the fat of the land." And you are bidden to add, "Do as follows: take from the land of Egypt wagons for your children and your wives, and bring your father here. And never mind your belongings, for the best of all the land of Egypt shall be yours. The sons of Israel did so. Joseph gave them wagons as Pharaoh had commanded, and he supplied them with provisions for the journey. To each of them, moreover, he gave a change of clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and several changes of clothing. And to his father he sent the following: 10 he-asses laden with the best things of Egypt, and 10 she-asses laden with grain, bread, and provisions for his father on the journey. And he sent his brothers off on their way. He told them, "Do not be quarrelsome on the way." They went up from Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. And they told him, "Joseph is still alive. Yes, he is ruler over the whole land of Egypt." His heart went numb, for he did not believe them. But when they recounted all that Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to transport him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. "Enough," said Israel. "My son Joseph is still alive. I must go and see him before I die."
Okay, let's pause there for a little bit. So before I jump in with any thoughts or reflections, does anyone have any questions or thoughts first?
I have
do.
to wonder how long it took for them to go up and down, back and forth. And what did were there, camel caravans? What did that look like?
Right. Yeah. So they do talk a little bit about that. And one of the questions the rabbi asks is, why was he saying him not to get distressed along the way? And some of the rabbis say is they don't want them quarreling along the way to divert their path or make it less likely they can get there and back. So yeah, you could imagine this whole scene, right? I mean, if you think about today, refugees in places of famine, right? You can see what's happening. You see the migration of hungry people moving across lands and deserts and oceans to get to places where they're safe and can get food, whether it's from war or famine. So we can imagine something more ancient times perhaps, but that's what I imagine it looked like. And along the way, I'm guessing it was a rough, unsafe journey in many ways. Yeah.
Rabbi, when Joseph essentially says, does say, "Do not be pained, do not be incensed with yourselves, that you sold me down here, because for sustenance God has sent me before you." So that to me sounds like what I have always in my mind have conceptualized as a Christian thing, a Christian theology, like God makes everything happen for a reason, but you might not know what the reason is, right? And it never really sounded like a Jewish thing, but here it is, right? In Genesis, all the near-death experiences Joseph had, the imprisonment, right? It's like he sees that there was a reason for it, so to speak. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that.
I mean, the rabbis go out of their way in this parsha in particular, but throughout the Torah to say this is the foreshadowing of what's going to happen. This was intended. So everything that's happening was an act of God carrying this out, so that because it was predicted in Abraham, right? It was told in the story of Abraham that they're going to be exiled for years in a strange land. So all this has to unfold for this to happen. So this is all preordained by the divine. That's how the rabbis talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't resonate for me, but that's what the rabbis say.
And also kind of interestingly enough that Moses was not able to apply this framework through the trials and tribulations, like that this is happening for God's plan, preordained, and so on.
Nor were the people at that time, right? Like many times they lost connection with the divine, and they saw some of the divine miracles right before their very eyes, and still they lost connection. Yeah. So Andre, and then Mark.
Rabbi, is there any interpretation for why the brothers did not recognize Joseph?
Well, so this is, I believe this is like 22 years later.
Okay.
And so this is years later. So I'm guessing, and he's also now, we can imagine him dressed in, it's okay, Dodie, quiet. He's friendly. He's just saying hello. We can imagine Joseph being dressed in Egyptian attire and, you know, like makeup and dress, you know, like he's part of the royalty now. So he probably looks very different. So I'm guessing that's why they don't recognize him. And it talks about the fact that Joseph can still understand Hebrew. So that's how he knows in the previous Parsha. He's hearing everything that they're saying because he understands Hebrew, but they don't know he understands Hebrew because in the meantime, there's also interpreters there interpreting for him.
And they also don't recognize him in as well because how they perceived of him in an earlier time was one way, and now how they're looking upon this person in front of them is free of those perceptions they had of their brother Joseph, filled with hatred, and so it's a different perception. It's just not recognizing the face; it's recognizing the whole persona is different.
And how old was he when they sold him?
He was about 18. And now he's supposedly 18 and 22, so 40. I'm doing my math right.
Yeah, it would look different.
Yeah, and right, and he's all dressed up, if you will. Mark.
I was wondering when Joseph said that God did this so that you could have a safe place to go. This was pretty much all interpretation by Joseph, right? And I mean, God didn't say these things. He was interpreting the events that unfolded. And maybe if there was a different idea, the outcomes would have happened differently in terms of the future for his family and, you know, in becoming slaves and all that. But what could one imagine that to be, that interpretation?
Right. Well, that's why the rabbis say it's all going to unfold this way because there was earlier in the story of Abraham the fact that your people are going to be exiled for a number of years. So that's how come the rabbis then tell this whole story is unfolding this way, and it was all part of God's plan.
Yeah, and I think what I'm trying to get at is if he had told a different story to his brothers and had a different understanding of the events and his relationship with God or with essence or truth, things could have unfolded so that, you know, the enslavement needn't have happened.
Yeah, potentially, right. Or he could have said, you're going to be here for a little bit of time and then you'll go back. Yeah. I think it's interesting that he's making all these predictions and presumptions. But even when he was when he was in the dungeon and Pharaoh called him out to interpret his dreams, he said to Pharaoh, "It's not my interpretations, it's God." So he seems to have some either articulated or actual connection or belief in divine source. Right? It's either just he's saying it or it's actually a connection that he's feeling. So it said in that chapter that we just read that it was pleasing in Pharaoh's eyes that his brothers were coming and that this was all unfolding in this way. And so Rambam interprets that to mean that, so Joseph, if you remember, was an ex-slave and an ex-convict. So Pharaoh apparently still has some discomfort or concern that the people might be wondering, why did he elevate this ex-slave and ex-convict to the second highest, most powerful person in Egypt? So now that Joseph's family is coming, it shows that he came from this prominent family, a respectable, prominent family. So I just think that's kind of intriguing and interesting. Like Pharaoh cares about that as the head of the Egyptians, that he still wants Joseph to be looked upon and himself to be looked upon in favorable ways by the people, right? But Sforno says that now that Joseph's family is coming to Egypt, Pharaoh's pleased because Joseph will stop thinking of himself as an alien and be more devoted to the interests of the land of Egypt. So I found that interesting because he's already amassing wealth for Pharaoh. Even before this part, he's already taken the excess food from the people and storing it and making them buy back their food that they were given, that they gave to the state. So he's already showing allegiance to the land and to Egypt. And yet, as it plays out, here you'll see he does it even more. So I kind of wonder if it actually played out that way, that now that his family's here, he does feel more connected. I'm also curious why he never goes back. Here he is, the second most powerful person in Egypt. He can basically do whatever he wants, and he never goes back. Like takes a journey and travels and checks in on his family. Yeah, go ahead, Carl. Good morning. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. It's good to see you again. I saw that I had some time here in Chicago to see you. So I kind of think about this from the convert's perspective of being a convert, of like people not understanding sometimes the perspective you're coming from as a convert and needing kind of that extra support of other converts. And I kind of see this kind of playing out. You use the term alien, but you can also supplement that for ger in our modern times when it comes to convert, and thinking about sometimes the converts need the strength of other converts around them to kind of understand better what's going on, and the kind of guide that comes from being with other converts. I also kind of think about this from the perspective of why he didn't come back. I'm a survivor of domestic violence from a parent and stuff, and I don't want to go back to Florida where my family lives at any time. And these brothers literally threw him in a pit and sold him into slavery. And he had these horrible experiences. Why would you want to go back to that? Yeah, you can redeem them and forgive them, but why would you want to go back to that? Why would the memories there are bad, despite your father giving you this great coat and like lifting you up? Those memories and stuff, that trauma is still there from that situation. Why would you want to put yourself back in, especially if you've reached the status that you've reached, becoming practically the prime minister? So,
Beautiful.
yeah.
Thank you.
I'm intrigued by that though, because he didn't want to go. What you're saying is, why would we want to go back? But you could also say, why would he want to bring his family and help them after that, after they did him wrong?
He seems to have. Go ahead, Carl.
Well, there's also like environmental factors. Like I think of my family, they live in a very like impoverished part of Florida. There's certain parts that are there. And even though his family is prominent, they don't have the prominence of the Egyptian pharaoh of the time too. And I could also see, I hate to say it could also come off as a charity case, but that's the other thing of like, look at the environment which they're under and stuff, and him wanting to take them out for that moment of that environment and give them some promise. But that's just another little, that's just me drashing off that. Sorry.
Yeah, that's great. So the other thing that I think about why he then invites him back is so when Judah approaches him and begs for Benjamin's life and begs to change places with him, that's the moment that Joseph realizes that there's been some shift, at least in Judah and maybe the other brothers. Because what the rabbis talk about is Joseph was concerned that they were treating Benjamin the same way they treated him, because Benjamin was also Rachel's son. So Joseph was concerned about Benjamin's well-being. So he wanted to know how he was and how he was being treated. And so once he sees that Judah steps up, then he starts to realize, oh, there's been some transformation. They're owning what happened. And there's this wonderful discussion amongst the rabbis about Judah's transformation. What brings Judah to the place where he's willing to step in for Benjamin? Judah was the one who said, we don't want to kill him. We'll sell him in slavery. So Judah's had this huge movement. And there's different reasons the rabbis talk about that. One of which is Judah, if you'll remember, lost 2 sons. So he's already aware of the pain and suffering of Jacob from losing Joseph and now potentially losing Benjamin. And he also had that interaction with Tamar. If you remember, he hired or had sex with Tamar, who disguised herself as a whore, as a harlot, and he has to give her. She smartly asks for some payment because he doesn't have any other payment, and so he gives her his staff and something else that are clearly marked as his. And when they come back to give her the lamb in exchange for the staff, lo and behold, they can't find her because she's not really a harlot. And then they find out that she's pregnant. His daughter-in-law is pregnant, but she's supposed to not be in relationship with anybody. And Joseph and Judah says, we'll have her stoned to death. And Tamar has his objects brought before him. And he says, and she says, whoever I'm pregnant with, these are their objects. So then Judah right there is confronted with, oh, that's me. And Judah says, she is more righteous than I. And so here's another part of Judah's transformation, of realizing his lack of righteousness, let's say, the places that he's missed the mark. And here now Judah steps in and he's more humble and he's pleading for Benjamin's life. And so that's part of this transition that happens with Judah. And that is what then moves the rabbis, what then moves Joseph, to feel a love again for his brother, to believe that his brothers are actually maybe transformed, or if nothing else, it transforms his inner heart. He softens. Which you can also, even in the situation of domestic violence, there is also that pull to want that love and to want that connection. And it can be a trauma bond. And so there's also potentially some of that happening here. And maybe there's some transition. And they're not going to live with him, right? They're going to live somewhere else. So he still can hold his status and his safety and his rulership. So if you want to jump in.
Yeah, there's a lot of play on words here. With Tamar and Judah, the word that Tamar uses to Judah when she presents the amulet, his object is, do you recognize this?
Yeah.
It's the same verb that is used here with Joseph and his brothers. Recognize, haker. And the word is also very close to the Hebrew word yakar, which means dear. But that's, and the other thing, if I may, there's a little saying that the words that Pope John the 23rd, when he met the Jewish delegation at Vatican II, for those of us old enough to remember Vatican II and Pope John 23rd, the words that Pope John 23rd said was, I am Joseph, your brother. Because his baptismal name was Joseph, Pope John. I think that's so beautiful.
No, interesting.
That's what he said to the Jewish delegation. I am Joseph, your brother. The same words. The other thing that, if I may say, Vayigash, the name of the Torah portion, is translated as Vayigash elav Yehuda, and Judah went up to him. But the other, the rabbis say that it can also mean that Judah went into himself. And that's the process of transformation we've been talking about. That Judah met himself, not so much met Joseph, but met himself. And it sets for us the stage for this transformative process that Judah goes through in giving his plea. And seeing the transformation, and Joseph seeing the transformation of Judah.
Yeah. So then at the end of this chapter, when Jacob hears the news. Yeah, go ahead. Before you.
Okay, yeah. So in all this duplicity of Joseph, one might say that he was creating the conditions for teshuva, right? That they were going to either sink or swim with this, right? And how they swam was with teshuva, right? The opportunity to have the brother enslaved again, right? The same similar situation, right? But choosing something different. So Judah, you may say, really embodied that. And then on the other side of it, Joseph's cries, and the power of that cry. In modern parlance, like let's unpack that, right? Like what's in that cry? Perhaps rage, right? Perhaps despair, perhaps joy, right? All at the same time. And Joseph could have landed on something else besides forgiveness, right? But Joseph himself, like I think it really shows like what true forgiveness is, and the intensity, right? The psychological, emotional toll, the cost of really forgiving at such a deep level.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful. And I just want us to hold that for a moment as we part of this part of the story. There's so many parts in the story, but this part of the story is really an example of the possibility of forgiveness. And it's interesting that you said that Pope John Paul said, "I'm Joseph, your brother," as an act of teshuva, right? As an act of forgiveness, perhaps. And as I think about this historical moment, right, with what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, like what would be even the first inch, the first step of that teshuva process? And maybe even just acknowledging, oh, I am your cousin. You're not the other. And maybe that requires a Vayigash within first, before we can Vayigash the other outside of ourselves. Like we have to, it's hard, right? We're having a hard time as a people really going in and looking at our own pain and sorrow and trauma and allowing that to stir in us transformation like was stirred in Judah and in Joseph in this moment. Joseph does problematic acts in a little bit, but in this interaction with his family, there is an awakening, and also within Judah. And so what is the move, if you will? What is the psycho-spiritual move? What is the actual act, words that our people need to take to unlock our hearts and our souls and move us toward ourselves and Palestinians, our cousins, so that we can start a process of teshuva? We are so far from there right now, it's hard to even imagine, but I just want to hold that in our hearts and souls in this moment. Yeah, Mark, please, and then I see you, Carl.
That was image of him crying, I was imagining that dream and that vision that he had early on, that he would, I forgot exactly how it was worded, but he would rule over his brothers or something like that. He was saying, oh my God, this is really coming true, but it's not what I expected at all. And just thinking about that and what you had just raised up is, how do we speak as a people? And we're in a very interesting situation, and our vision for what we are as Jewish people it needs to be reevaluated, and our ideas of who we are, in that vision that we have, they need to be reassessed.
Yeah, thank you. Carl, did you want to add something?
Yeah, well, for me, I feel, I'm going to use a generational term here. I feel like the conversations have got so politicized, they've become basic. If you're familiar with the millennial or the Gen Z term of basic, it's almost just at this like very kind of not a very concrete level. It's not going past anything past the binary that's been applied at times to the conversation. I think there's just a lot of politicization that's happened over these things, and not a lot of spiritualization. And I think I take it from the end of human rights. I was born on December 10th, which is International Human Rights Day. And I think we're not talking about the human rights element in any of this at points. We're only talking about it sometimes from whatever political talking points it's coming at. And I think there's a spiritual answer kind of within the human rights. People are getting killed, people are taking hostage. Both of those things, if you've read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are things that just should not be going on or should not be happening. On that basic human level, we're not practicing the Vayigash that we pray every day. That there's something that in that which we pray every day as Jews that we kind of are forgetting in this. And I feel both Bibi and I feel like even some of Hamas have both taken this issue and turned it into a binary thing, when where is God in all of that? Where is that spiritualization? Where is that Vayigash and those human rights within it? So, yeah.
Thank you.
We don't say the Vayigash every day for nothing 3 times a day.
Right. Nor is love the stranger repeated 36 times in the Torah more than any other mitzvah for no reason, right? So, yeah, how do we turn toward each other in love, in compassion? And where do we find, and that's back to like, where do we make that first step? The only thing I feel responsible for is for the Jewish role in this. So where is what is our role in this? So one of the things, this is a beautiful little story, I'm taking us on a different tangent now, is when Jacob receives the news of Joseph still being alive, he's obviously shocked and doesn't believe it. And there's 2 different pieces here, but there's a midrash that says the brothers were so worried that it would shock him so much that he might like have a heart attack and die. So they sent one of the granddaughters, Sirach, to prepare him, and she played the harp. And so she played this beautiful harp and gently sang to him and told him that Joseph was still alive and the ruler of Egypt, so that by the time the brothers got there and told the story, he had already been marinated, if you will, in this beautiful musical medley. So his heart could handle it. Which I just think is a really beautiful image, like when you have shocking news to tell somebody, how can we do it in a way that's integrated and loving and soft as possible? And so here's a model that the Torah puts for us, which I just think is really beautiful. But then the other thing they talk about is that he couldn't believe them. He was like so shocked he didn't believe them, which if you think about the fact that they lied to him in the past and now he's realizing that, right? You could understand why he'd be skeptical and not believe them. And to me, this speaks a lot about the dangers of lying, right? Because then your truth becomes untrustworthy. Then your integrity becomes meaningless if you lie. If it's in your tendency to lie, then when do we know when to trust someone who lies a lot? And so I was thinking about that when I was reading that. It's just really hard for him to believe them when he tells them that he's still alive, because they've told him in the past that he had been killed. So, any other reflections or thoughts? Welcome. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. Yeah, I'm noticing how similar what you just said is to that.
That quote on the wall.
Yeah.
Do you want to say more about that?
Well, I didn't take it in very deeply, but I just noticed parallels while you were talking.
Mm-hmm.
But let's see.
So this is the quote. I'm just going to read it while you're thinking. So this is the Heschel quote that I often quote for us. It says, "Prayer is meaningless unless it is subversive, unless it seeks to overthrow and ruin the pyramids of callousness, hatred, opportunism, falsehoods. A liturgical movement must become a revolutionary movement. seeking to overthrow the forces that destroy the promise, the hope, the vision. And you've heard me talk about how we try to make our liturgical movement and our Torah study a combination of that and the other Heschel quote about awe, wonder, and radical amazement. So I'm appreciating that you're experiencing that connection right now. Yeah, did you want to say more?
I wanted to say something about what you brought up previously. Would that be distracting?
No. Can everyone hear? If you could talk
I
louder.
have a loud voice.
But they're having a hard time hearing you.
I mean, I can use it.
Okay, please do.
I loved what you said about the first step is to face our pain about what's going on in the Middle East. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, and we're not ready for an action maybe. That's a really great first step, maybe to admit that and find a way towards that. I just love that. I mean, it's very true for me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the way I'm finding to face my pain is so dissociated.
Yeah.
It was very moving. And everything I've heard since I've come in, really moving. Oh my gosh.
Thank you. Yeah.
And one more thing, and the forgiveness among siblings is very meaningful to me. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Deep forgiveness.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep going because there's still a whole big part coming that we need to discuss.
I can read if you want.
Oh, go ahead, Jacqueline. Great. Heidi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi. So Israel set out with all that was his, and he came to Beersheba, where he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac's. God called to Israel in a vision by night, Jacob, Jacob, he answered. Here, I am God, the God of your father's house. Fear not to go down to Egypt, for I will make you there into a great nation. I myself will go with you to Egypt, and I myself will also bring you back, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. So Jacob set out from Beersheba. The sons of Israel put their father Jacob and their children and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to transport him. And they took along their livestock and the wealth that they had amassed in the land of Canaan. Thus Jacob and all his offspring with him came to Egypt. He brought with him to Egypt his sons and grandsons, his daughters and granddaughters, all his offspring. These are the names of the Israelites, Jacob and his descendants who came to Egypt. Jacob's firstborn, Reuben, Reuben's sons, Enoch, Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. Simeon's sons, Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Jahin, Zohar, and Saul, the son of a Canaanite woman. Levi's sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Judah's sons, Onan, Shelah, Perez, and Zerah. But Onan had died in the land of Canaan, and Perez's sons were Hezron and Hamul. Issachar's sons, Tola, Puva, Yob, and Shimron. Zebulun's sons, Sered, Elon, and Jaleel. These were the sons whom Leah bore to Jacob in Padanaram, in addition to his daughter Dinah, persons in all, male and female, 33. God's sons, Ziphion, Hagi, Shuni, Hezbon, Eri, Arodi, and Areli. Asher's sons, Imnah, Ishva, Ishvi, and Beriah, and their sister Sarah. Beriah's sons, Heber and Malchiel. These were the descendants of Zilpah, whom Laban had given to his daughter Leah. These she bore to Jacob, 16 persons. The sons of Jacob's wife Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. To Joseph were born in the land of Egypt Manasseh and Ephraim, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Benjamin's sons, Bela, Becher, Ashbel, Gera, Naaman, Ehi, Rosh, Lupim, Hupim, and Ard. These were the descendants of Rachel, who were born to Jacob. 14 persons in all. Dan's son, Hushim, Naphtali's sons, Jazil, Guni, Jezer, and Shilem. These were the descendants of Bilhah, whom Laban had given to his daughter Rachel. There she bore Jacob. She bore to Jacob 7 persons in all. All the persons belonging to Jacob who came to Egypt, his own issue, aside from the wives of Jacob's sons, all these persons numbered 66. And Jacob's sons who were born to him in Egypt were 2 in number. Thus, the total of Jacob's household who came to Egypt was 70 persons. He had sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to point the way before him to Goshen. So when they came to the region of Goshen, Joseph ordered his chariot and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. He presented himself to him, and embracing him around the neck, he wept on his neck a good while. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Now I can die, having seen for myself that you are still alive." Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and tell the news to Pharaoh and say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. They happen to be shepherds. They have always been breeders of livestock, and they have brought with them their flocks and herds and all that is theirs. So when Pharaoh summons you and asks, 'What is your occupation?' you shall answer, 'Your servants have been breeders of livestock from the start until now, both we and our fathers, so that you may stay in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are abhorrent to Egyptians.' Then Joseph came and reported to Pharaoh, saying, 'My father and my brothers with their flocks and herds and all that is theirs have come from the land of Canaan and are now in the region of Goshen.' And carefully selecting a few of his brothers, he presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, 'What is your occupation?' They answered Pharaoh, 'We, your servants, are shepherds, as were also our fathers. We have come,' they told Pharaoh, 'to sojourn in this land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, the famine being severe in the land of Canaan. Pray then, let your servants stay in the region of Goshen.' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'As regards your father and your brothers who have come to you, the land of Egypt is open before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them stay in the region of Goshen. And if you know some men of ability among them, put them in charge of my livestock.' Joseph then brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob greeted Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked Jacob, 'How many are the years of your life?' And Jacob answered Pharaoh, 'The years of my sojourn on earth are 130. Few and hard have been the years of my life, nor do they come up to the lifespans of my ancestors during their sojourns.' Then Jacob bade Pharaoh farewell and left Pharaoh's presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers, giving them holdings in the choicest part of the land of Egypt, in the region of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Joseph sustained his father and his brothers and all his father's household with bread, down to the little ones. Now there was no bread in all the world, for the famine was very severe. Both the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph gathered in all the money that was to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan as payment for the rations that were being procured. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's palace. And when the money gave out in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, 'Give us bread, lest we die before your very eyes, for the money is gone.' Joseph said, 'Bring your livestock, and I will send to you against your livestock if the money is gone.' So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, for the stocks of sheep and cattle and the asses. Thus he provided them with bread that year in exchange for all their livestock. And when that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, 'We cannot hide from my lord that with all the money and animal stocks consigned to my lord, nothing is left at my lord's disposal save our persons and our farmland. Let us not perish before your eyes, both we and our land. Take us and our land in exchange for bread, and we with our land will be serfs to Pharaoh. Provide the seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become a waste. So Joseph gained possession of all the farmland of Egypt for Pharaoh, all the Egyptians having sold their fields because the famine was too much for them. Thus the land passed over to Pharaoh, and he removed the population town by town from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests did he not take over, for the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh had made to them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, whereas I have this day acquired you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you to sow the land. And when the harvest comes, you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be yours as seed for the fields and as food for you and those in your households and as nourishment for your children. And they said, you have saved our lives. We are grateful to my Lord, and we shall be serfs to Pharaoh. And Joseph made it into a land law in Egypt, which is still valid, that 1/5 should be Pharaoh's, only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. Thus Israel settled in the country of Egypt, in the region of Goshen. They acquired holdings in it and were fertile and increased greatly.
Okay.
Jacob, okay.
Yeah, that's the end of the parsha. Thank you. Okay, are people tracking what's just happened here?
It's a lot to track.
Yeah, right. So what are people noticing? I'm going to ask you guys to kind of share. What are you noticing that Joseph does here to the Egyptians, right? Not to his family in Goshen.
Austerity measures.
It's one thing to call it, for sure.
Huge transfer of wealth.
Right. And land. Right. Huge transfer of wealth and land. What else?
Exploitation of the weak.
Yep.
He's extorting them.
Yes, he certainly is. Yep.
He pretty much takes over and decides whether they will survive or not.
And where they will live. Did you catch that part? He had them moved around the country into different places. Is this ringing a bell?
Yep.
So the other thing about moving people that happens is when you disperse people from the land that they've lived on their whole life with their community, you break up communities. So he might not have broken up families, we don't really know, but he certainly broke up community connections and ties, right? And the danger of that, or the power of that, depending on how you look at it, as the ones who are dispersed and broken up, is now you don't trust people necessarily. You have to re-establish community connections and ties and trust people. But when you have close-knit communities, you can build resistance to power. Right? And he completely undermines their capacity to build resistance to power. And I'm reminded of when I was in Palestine and given a tour by Breaking the Silence, which is of people who served in the IDF who are breaking their silence and telling about what's happened. It's a wonderful organization. They told the story of going into Palestinian homes and taking over the home, and and they just do this just to faux distrust in the community. That is the only reason that they do this. They know it's not actually a terrorist home, and they intentionally make it not a terrorist home. And they do this in various homes. And what ends up happening is then the neighbors and the people in the community don't know if those folks in whose homes they've placed themselves, the army, have become informants for the state of Israel. So it undermines community trust. So in that instance, they're not moving people around, but they're finding other ways to break up and undermine community connections. And communities of care, right? When you're living in communities of care, I mean, we have meal trains here, right? And who responds to people's meal trains? People that you're connected with. They could live across the country or across the world, or they could live next door, but you get communities of care and support. And when you move people around and disperse people and break them up, certainly in that time, and certainly in Gaza and the West Bank, where it's more and more difficult to just send someone a DoorDash card, for example, you undermine the capacity for people to build a movement and build community connections, both to support their survival, but also to stand up to the oppressor. And that's what I see Joseph having done here. Not only does he make them indentured servants and do this massive transfer of wealth and land, but he also makes it really hard for the people to stand together in solidarity because he's dispersed them throughout the land. Andre.
Why is Joseph doing this? I keep, all of these things, one thing after the other. I mean, has he gone over to the dark side? What in God's name, what is happening here? It's a betrayal of the trust, even that it seems to me sort of that the Pharaoh and his people have put in him. I don't know, even though it is benefiting his family, as you're pointing out, there are all kinds of collateral community damage that's going on. I mean, is it just to teach us lessons? That this was written to teach us lessons, but within the narrative itself, what has happened to him? Why is he doing all of this?
Well, if you remember when we were reading earlier in this parsha, Joseph elaborates on how great he is and how much power he has. Right? He goes on and on. I am the king. I am only second to Pharaoh. I have control of all the land and all. So unlike Judah, who we see have this transformation over these past few stories that we've read, past few weeks, we don't really see Joseph really having that same level of transformation. Joseph perhaps is still the traumatized child who was favored. Don't forget, he was a favored child. So he was put on a pedestal from his father his whole life. And he perhaps is still reaching for that pedestal that he keeps getting put on, right? Like he goes to Egypt to get sold in slavery and you think, oh, that's going to be awful. But even in Egypt, when he first gets there, he's then put the second to Potiphar, right? He's given power over Potiphar's entire house, only second to Potiphar. And then his wife is interested in him, finds him attractive, or is jealous of him and has him thrown into prison, accuses him of rape. But then even in prison, he ends up being the second to the warden, right? And then he gets out of prison and then he becomes the second to Pharaoh. So he's constantly, for apparently no reason, put into incredible positions of power over people in a society that is a society of, it has slavery, right? It's a society of disproportionate, of hierarchical structures, intense hierarchical structures. And so he doesn't really know any differently. He doesn't really see, it seems like, the possibility of distributing the resources in an egalitarian way. He doesn't really seem to have that vision. His vision is one of power over. Carl.
I'm just having something rising as we're talking about this, and I don't know if I want to pivot in a very progressive kind of way of thinking about this, but I kind of think about this with when it's come to Democratic candidates as of lately, even though they're people who are coming at as people of color or people who are LGBTQ, like Pete Buttigieg or something like that. At times I felt more that they haven't stood for that intersectional liberation as much as those who would actually stand for it, and they've just been kind of put up for the sake of their identity and stuff, and that's been seen as the answer. and not exactly the liberatory parts of it. Like Pete Buttigieg himself, I have an issue with him as a gay man because he did not stand up for healthcare rights. And we still have many in our community that are suffering from AIDS and STDs that are going on. And he did not even stand up for healthcare rights. At first he did, but then he pivoted the moment he found out he could get some kind of power. I kind of see a similar thing playing out. Of the moment this happens, all this kind of compromising happens. So why would he sell out his people? Well, why did Obama sell out the people of Flint and drink that water in front of them? It's the same reason. We've seen this play out, this Torah play out in our modern times with people we've thought were like standing for these issues and the people, but they weren't totally. And that's also a deep honesty we need to give ourselves as a country, to not say that, yeah, these people, they did check a box, but they didn't check that box for intersectional liberation.
Right, and I think power also does tend to corrupt us, or at least corrupt some of us, and he's modeling that. Maybe also he's trying to truly show his allegiance to the Egyptians and to Pharaoh, really, not to the Egyptian people, but to Pharaoh. Maybe he doesn't really trust his place securely, and so he's trying to amass wealth to show, look at how much I'm serving you. But yeah, Brent.
Yes, when I'm struck when you said a minute ago, for no reason. I would think there is a reason why. Well, with Pharaoh, it was I guess partly his interpretation of dreams, but could well be that Joseph is extremely handsome and bright and articulate and has many attributes that are very attractive to not only Pharaoh and the royalty, but to we don't know what the average Egyptian thinks of him, how he comes across, but we know among the powers that are in place, he comes across well, and I think that maybe tells us to be, I don't know about wary, but because a person has attributes, gifts from God or from their environment or from their background or genetics, that can be wonderful, but not to, because they have those, assume and think that they have the knowledge and the wherewithal and the moral compass to do the right thing. We need checks and balances, basically, in any system, and I think that this is obviously lacking. But I think when you said it for no reason, it struck me, well, must be reasons, though we don't know. Pharaoh's could be, he liked the color of his eyes or something. We don't know, but there are probably reasons, but that doesn't justify that much, all this power in any individual. And I think skepticism is part of people trying to have control and trying to have a say in their destiny and in the morality of their society. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, so we know that he rose to power because he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh believed them, and they turned out to be true, right? They were in fact a prophecy. And then when Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, he didn't just say, oh, the dream tells you there's going to be 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. That was the dream. But if you remember what Joseph then does, Joseph then says, and you need to appoint someone who's in charge of all the food and resources in the land so that it can be distributed during the 7 years of famine. That wasn't the dream. Joseph just put his interpretation on it. And then Pharaoh says, well, who's more wise than this person? So we'll appoint him. So that's how that unfolds. And we could say it was right. Joseph is smart and clever, and he happens to be good at interpreting dreams. But as you said, that doesn't mean he's ethically and morally worthy of having the power that he has. And one of the things I love in our Torah is it says when the people say, give us a king, appoint us a king, we want a king like all other nations. And God engages in this discussion and doesn't want them to have a king, and fights and finally concedes to letting them have the king. And then God says, but you need to have the Torah read every day. Right? Because you need to have some spiritual, ethical, moral grounding. Because when you become so powerful, you lose touch with what matters most. So don't forget to read 36 times to love the stranger. Don't forget that you were strangers in the land of Egypt and you were the oppressed. Because if you forget you were the oppressed, you forget that there are oppressors. And you might then become the oppressor. Yeah. So it's a beautiful warning, and it would behoove us, all of us with any power, to really take to heart these teachings and these warnings. I also think this may be, a lot of times I read the Torah, and we've talked about this before, as warnings. So we could also read this story, right, as a warning of what not to do. Of a warning to not be an oppressive dictator who takes people's lands and money and makes them sell themselves into indentured servitude. So Andre, I know you're asking why would Joseph do it? But if you read it through the lens of this is a warning of what not to do, then that's how it can fold out. But it also is, as we've talked about, predictions, or not just predictions, but laying out what's going to end up happening, because what ends up happening in Exodus, we have one more parsha to read before Exodus, but what ends up happening, right, is a new Pharaoh arises who doesn't remember Joseph and is concerned about the Hebrews becoming so prolific and having so much resources that they are going to rise up against Pharaoh and start a war or pretend with other people. And so that begins the process of enslavement. And maybe the people remembered what Joseph did. And because he brought his family, they knew that he was in fact a Hebrew and not an Egyptian. And so it ends up, right, the oppressed becomes the oppressor, and then the oppressor becomes the oppressed. And this is a cycle that happens. And I think maybe it's upon us, Elenu, to think about how do we disrupt that cycle? Because we're watching it unfold right now, and now we're creating trauma in people, incredible trauma, generational trauma. What do we need to do to break this cycle so that the oppressed doesn't become the oppressor, and then the oppressor, the oppressed, so that we create an entirely different world that is more egalitarian?
Well, I think we maybe get rid of the Pharaoh of Israel.
Yes.
That's a start, but this dynamic in Israel is not just one person.
Yeah.
I know, but one person is so powerful that he can make it continue. You're right, but that is absolutely necessary to go forward.
Certainly a first step, definitely.
Well,
Yeah.
I think we also need to think about it at the practical and grassroots level. I think in my own organizing lately, I've kind of started to say, I'm not going to work with any person who exhibits narcissistic qualities, because and put some boundaries around that and start cutting resources from them when I notice that they have those kind of qualities. Because I think that on the grassroots level, we've compromised a lot to a lot of narcissism. And we have to think about this, I think, from that spiritual level and that depth of that core at the grassroots. What we kind of do in the micro does impact the macro. What are we standing for? What ideas are we producing at the grassroots level? We've compromised when it's come to narcissistic leadership. So we have narcissistic leadership. So if I've thought about that on just the local level, I'm just not going to work with any narcissist. And if somebody has those kind of qualities and I have to work with them, I'm going to just cut off the resources that I have to that kind of person, because I think it is a grassroots way to do it. We think so macro, and then we think we can't do anything when there are these micro kind of things. You don't want Trump in office? Stand against the Trumps that are around you, and cut them off. Not just the Republicans, because we can build some bridges with the Republicans. I do think that's possible with some of them, but yeah, take out the narcissist and their power. You want Netanyahu to go? Take out those who hold the similar views and the similar actions towards these people who just want more power. Cut the narcissist off totally. That's the grassroots thing to do, I feel.
Can we disagree on this site?
Yeah, you can disagree. So do you want to share
Let's
something?
hope so.
Yeah, you want to share something?
Yeah, I really, it was helpful for me to hear about the polarities, like the trauma victims and the oppressors that are out of control, and the awareness, like power can be so intoxicating. I mean, even attention, even having attention in front of people is intoxicating, and it requires balance. And gosh, so hard to say that. I forgot what I wanted to say after that. Maybe that's all I want to say. I'm really glad that came forward. That was very helpful for me.
Great, thank you. If you're cold, you can turn it up. Just push it. Just push it and turn it to the right. It'll go up. Mark. Is it Mark? Is that Mike? Sorry, I didn't think it was Mark, but I couldn't remember. Forgive me.
No, it's quite all right. I just appreciate this so much. I'm here on the East Coast. I had my Torah study group this morning, and I just really love coming here.
Great. Mike, you're freezing.
I started studying Torah.
There you go. I'm going to suggest you turn off your video for a moment, just because you're freezing, and we might be able to hear you.
Okay.
I love seeing you, but
okay. Is this better? Can you hear me now?
Yes, it is better.
Okay. Yes. So when I started studying Torah, I would be so judgmental of the characters, and the rabbi would kind of slow me down and say, hey, you're looking at it through today's lens, judging what happened thousands of years ago. But the longer I study Torah, I see that we're confronted. I think really to kind of Carl's point, I saw Heidi put something similar in the chat about power, and so I love how you were saying, Rabbi, how this sort of foreshadows Deuteronomy, which sort of foreshadows kings, right? That as humans ascend in power, they do wrong. I mean, it blew my mind when I was in my 40s or whatever, when I reread the story of Solomon, right? That goodness, even when he got power, right, he turned to idol worship, right? And so all this tells us the story of what not to do. And I think what we're still left to struggle with is the story of what to do. Carl has a theory about cutting out narcissists or whatever, but we still haven't figured it out, right? How so it seems, right, in what we might call Western civilization, at least, right? How does one rise to power and be fair and implement justice and equity and so on, right? And I mean, I love about coming to this particular study, because this is, I feel like, what we're talking about, which is really the challenge of our time, which may be the challenge of the times throughout the ages of recorded history.
Right. Yeah.
Rabbi, I kind of have a rebuttal to him, if it's okay. Could I give that, or
It's
no?
quick. Yeah. Quick.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, we are told those as Jews to build fences around the Torah, and I do think there's also, Rabbi, you hit on this, of the fact of these being warnings and stuff. like I do think at times there's a reason for clear boundaries and stuff with things. And we have had a rise of horrible leadership that's come up in our country and in other spaces. And that's why I say I think cutting off resources to narcissists once they're identified as such, especially in our organizing communities, is not a bad thing. It's a grassroots kind of thing. And it's saying, I'm standing against the idea of your person, of what you're kind of trying to do. It may seem radical, but there's been a lot of pivot. There's been a lot of compromise, and that absolute power has corrupted. There has to be a stand and a fence built eventually.
Thank you. I don't think that's actually counter to what he's saying. I think that what I heard Mike raising for a question for all of us is, what is it what points us towards what we should do in a positive way? So certainly what you're saying is one possible thing, but I also think it's in addition to that, there's another deeper spiritual question for us, which is, maybe the way I'll phrase it is, what are our spiritual guideposts? What are our psycho-spiritual guideposts that we can look to and say, oh, I'm straying from that. I'm walking on this path, right? The derech, the path of the divine. I'm trying to walk in the path of the divine. And where do we stray from that? Now, right, in our tradition, it's a mitzvot. Like, if you follow the mitzvot, then you're on this path. But some of the mitzvot I don't necessarily think are what's really going to make me an ethical, integral person, right? So I think all of us have maybe the calling, if we're here, if we're trying to practice some form of spiritual practices and religion, the spiritual, ethical God calling to determine our spiritual, psycho-spiritual path to live in integrity ourselves and in the right way with the world. Right?
I just want to say one thing. Can I say something? I just was reflecting on President Carter, and I just want us to think there are some good people that have been leaders, and may his soul rest in peace. That's all I want to say. Yeah.
Yeah. So we each of us find our path, and hopefully there's learnings from Torah study and from our liturgical movement and liturgy and psalms and prayers that help us find that path. So there was, this morning, one of the lines was, who knows how to turn anger's strength to furthering life's intention? Just that is huge, right? Another one is, may the work of our hands reflect the handiwork of the divine. There's lots of little guideposts that can help us to turn back, love the other, love the stranger. What are we doing? And yeah, I don't have access to all those in power to say, hey, you're way off. You're way off the derech. You're like over there. But if we as individuals try to live in this path and build movements and communities and families and connections that try to live in this path, then eventually, hopefully, right, we can get enough power that's in alignment with these values, with these intentions, so that when we have the power and the strength, we actually are doing it in a way that's in alignment with these values that we articulate and hope to access in our lives. So I'll just end by saying, every Shabbat we remind ourselves that we were slaves. And we do that so that we remember what it's like to be oppressed, so that when we see oppressed people, when we come across the most vulnerable, that we turn towards them instead of away, that we turn to someone who's unhoused on the street and ask them how we can help, rather than turn away out of the discomfort that we face when we see them, or whatever feelings that arise in us. And also so that we don't become the oppressor. So we say it not only so we have compassion for the oppressed, but so that we have the humility to know that the path to becoming the oppressor is actually much easier than we think. And to remind us to walk in this world with humility and love, and to turn toward the other, and the other within ourselves even, so that we can approach our own selves and each other, hopefully through our transform process of doing our untangling our traumas. So
Can I share?
I'd like to end it there, if that's okay. You can share with us after. Okay, thanks. So Shabbat Shalom, I'm going to end it there. We're going to return now to finish the blessings. I just want to say something in February before I forget. I'm going to say this now, but you also get an email. In February, we're going to do the 2nd and 4th Shabbats of the month because I am busy on the 1st and 3rd Shabbats, as it turns out. That's unusual. So next month, you'll get an email, but we'll still meet in 2 weeks in January, and then we'll meet in the 2nd and 4th Shabbat Saturday of February. Okay, thank you. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet b'chayei olam v'ata b'tocheinu baruch Yashefina notenet haTorah.
Amen.